Welcome, everyone. I'm Marty Pickett, trustee, managing director, and general counsel at RMI. And I've been privileged to be here for over 20 of the past 40 years. So I'm really delighted to lead this conversation with you today as we look to the future. Our exact anniversary date is actually next week, the 28th, but it seems fitting that we're having this conversation today as we await tomorrow's Earth Day. I think this hour is going to be informative and inspiring. We have had well over hundreds of people register, so we'll see how many get to join us. And we have over 18 countries represented. And a very special welcome to our Solutions Council and Innovator Circle members who are sponsoring today's webinar. Thank you for your continued giving. And our Legacy Society members who have already named RMI in their estate planning. And I have to give a shout out to a longtime donor who's been with RMI for as long as I have. He's not able to join today, but he'll be watching the recording. Thank you for getting us here. Fred, stand back. I'm delighted to be joined today by some of my RMI colleagues. We'll be hearing first from Amory Lovins, our co-founder and chairman emeritus, who remains closely involved with RMI, including as a trustee. Jules Kortenhorst, our CEO. Leia Guccione, our managing director of carbon-free electricity. Rushad Nanavatty, our managing director of urban transformation. And Brian O'Hanlon, our managing director for climate-aligned finance. Amory, I'm going to start with you. We'd love to hear some of your reflections about RMI's 4-decade milestone. And I'm wondering if you can imagine what RMI would look like today in 1982.
Well, thank you, Marty. 54 years ago, I wrote my first professional paper on climate change. Humanity obviously needed to avoid 2 existential risks linked to energy: climate change and nuclear proliferation, plus about 10 more. Energy was the master key, so I decided to work on it. And 51 years ago, I resigned as an Oxford Don because energy, they said, wasn't an academic subject. Now Oxford has hundreds of energy researchers. I was just 4 decades early. 2 years later came the era of oil embargo. 2 years after that, my soft energy path graph took shape on a shell blackboard in London. And the next year, 1976, my foreign affairs paper reframed the energy problem. I began spreading and applying that idea with relentless patience, pacing for the tenacious long game, because it was clear it would take us a half century in which we had to transform complex, high inertia institutions and economies 1,000,000 times our size. So after writing Brittle Power for the Pentagon and Least Cost Energy Solving the CO2 Problem for the German Environment Ministry, 40 years ago, somewhere around Nebraska, Hunter and I conceived RMI in our little Datsun pickup truck. We funded its first year with $10,000 of our speaking fees, gathered volunteers to start building our home and office, and began hiring a dozen colleagues who would work in the library. Use back there, we ended up donating for the next 27 years. New leadership, now with the incredible energy of Jules and his team, grew that baby into now a grandparent with a big family. 7 shares, 4 CEOs, scores of trustees, probably cumulatively upwards of 1,000 staff later over these 4 decades, have now brought us to an exciting place of prominence, power, and promise. We initially worked mainly on energy and on security, where our work reportedly helped Gorbachev decide to stand down the Cold War. We also explored water, agriculture, forestry, transgenics, critical materials, healthcare, economic renewal for distressed Western mining towns. We invented and systematized green real estate development, laid many of the foundations for modern electricity, building and auto design, and renewable and distributed power. And we created the world's most detailed synthesis of advanced energy efficiency. Our focus later narrowed to energy, while our work became immensely deeper and more influential, both topically and in big syntheses like natural capitalism, small is profitable, winning the oil endgame, and reinventing fire. Turning scarcity by inattention into abundance by design, we combined novel design, technology, strategy, and policy with barrier busting, institutional acupuncture, and enlisting people of diverse views by focusing on outcomes, not motives. We did solutions, not problems, practice, not theory, transformation, not incrementalism. And it's working. Over $700 billion a year of investment has fled from fossil fuels to efficiency and renewables each year. Largely, our wholly renewable power is proving reliable, clean, deflationary, and secure, cutting global emissions in half in this decade and then going carbon-free just in time for 1.5 degrees is looking hard, but possible. We've already seen US energy productivity rise 156%, and renewables take 95% of the global market for net new generating capacity. But both these halves of the energy solution are just starting to accelerate to full speed and scale. Happily, innovation, often enabled by RMI, keeps expanding the solution space, from solar electric cars that need no recharging, to air conditioners that need no electricity, to buildings that need little cement or steel. Our most potent tool, though, is not a technology, it's our state of mind. RMI strives in a spirit we call applied hope. As people can't be depressed into action. Instead, we rekindle hope and ignite action by visibly, tangibly, scalably helping each day to build a world worth being hopeful about. And hope is not something you have, it's something you do. Applied hope is not mere glandular optimism. Hope is a stance, not an assessment, but it's our responsibility to make hope possible, not despair convincing, by sparking and spreading the solutions that make hope real and practical. That's what winds up our key every morning. The climate science model, conservatively understate the speed and the runaway potential of climate change, while the climate choice models, at least equally conservatively, understate how we can stop climate change, often not at a cost, but at a profit. Offsetting those two biases makes despair and complacency equally unwarranted, so we adopt neither. Instead, we devise, develop, and scale and show everyone how to do what is difficult but necessary in this critical moment, the most important moment since we walked out of Africa, the moment when humanity has exactly enough time, starting now. I'm forever grateful to all of you who keep our work vibrant, our people effective, those around you inspired by applied hope, and the world verdant and receptive to the new work that my colleagues will describe next. Thank you.
Thanks, Amory. And I think it's fair to say on behalf of everyone, not just folks on this call, we're so grateful for your vision, founding RMI, and your continued dedication to this work. It's really incredible. And you framed the context for this discussion well, because we'll be hearing more about your founding premise that the world needs solutions, not theories, to tackle the energy transition. So I'm excited now to turn to the panel, hear about some of RMI solutions to some of these toughest climate problems. We'll have time at the end of the questions. You saw that in your chat, but please submit them as we go through the conversation in the chat, and we'll be trying to get to as many of those as possible. We'll follow up as needed, and we'll certainly send the recording out as well. Jules, I'd like to kick off our panel with you, and then you can help bring in others. We see every day how our global politics are causing instability and human tragedy. It's really depressing and worrisome, and it's also shaking the energy sector. And climate scientists around the world are saying it's a now or never moment. And certainly in that recent report from the International Panel on Climate Change, that IPCC report underscored the extreme urgency of the climate crisis. And I know that's a challenge you wake up facing every morning. So I'd love for you to share about how you believe RMI's work aligns with the recommendations in that report.
Thank you, Marty. And yes, you're right that IPCC report was in some ways depressing, worrisome. Basically, the first part of the report said we're facing a planetary boundary. The second report said suffering has already started and is accelerating. And the third report, just published 2 weeks ago, said we're not on track. We need to dramatically scale all the solutions. And even then, if we're going to hit that 1.5 degrees, every fraction of a degree really matters. It's going to be touch and go. But here's the good news. If you read that third part of the IPCC report, it lists a whole slew of potential solutions. And when we studied the report and compared them to the portfolio of activities of RMI, we were encouraged. It was clear from the report and from our portfolio that we've been working on the right things. We've been working right on the sort of important, urgent matters that the IPCC underlines now need to scale momentously. So let me just list a few. And in the meantime, I'm posting in the chat window a blog that our colleague John Kreitz recently wrote, which goes into more detail on all these matches between RMI's portfolio and the IPCC report. But today we have Leia Guccione here. She leads our electricity practice, and electricity is going to be the cornerstone of our future clean energy system. So Leia will talk about how we move from coal-fired power generation to clean energy portfolios and don't build out more gas. Clean electricity then also becomes the cornerstone of so many of the other things we do in the energy economy, whether it's mobility or buildings, and we have lots of work going on in that area. And all of that with more efficient applications, a cornerstone of RMI thinking for 40 years. The IPCC also highlights the critical importance of eliminating leakage of methane. As Amory has said in the past, CO2 sort of is like heart disease. You need to get on a diet and you need to do it fast, but methane is like a bleeding artery. You're at risk of dying immediately if you don't fix it. Methane needs to be solved now. We need to stop the leakage of methane because it is 86 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than CO2. So our big program in that area is important. The IPCC highlights the critical role of cities around the world. And Rushad Nanavatty, he is here on the line just in from India this morning, he told us. So if he's a bit groggy, then we know why that is the case. But cities are a key part of the solution of driving the implementation of decarbonization. And finally, we will only be able to do this if capital flows at massive scale. So excited to have Brian Hanlon here. Brian Hanlon is the managing director for our climate finance program, and he'll tell you more about the work that we've got going on in that area. So let's start off with you, Leia. What's the exciting stuff happening in the electricity practice?
Well, thank you, Jules. And it's great to be sharing this opportunity to speak with so many of RMI's longtime friends and supporters and partners in industry and other stakeholders from across the world. So really appreciative of this opportunity. Our carbon-free electricity team is doing so many things. It's hard to point to just one work stream or project that we have going on right now. But one of the ones that is particularly exciting is our work to support and accelerate the transition away from coal-fired power plants globally. In the most recent IPCC report, as well as consistently many of the reports produced by the panel previously, the scientists and the research continue to point to coal generation as the single most impactful thing we can do to radically reduce the emissions of energy systems, and in particular, our electricity systems. The challenge is that huge numbers of the coal plants that are operating globally have actually been built fairly recently in the last 20 years or so, and very much so in developing economies and emerging markets where those citizens and those communities desperately need new reliable power to grow their economies and support improvements in the living conditions of those communities. And so what you have is this challenge where there's been a lot of recent investment in these coal plants, and now we need to work with those countries, we need to work with those utilities to say, how can we help you replace those coal plants with something that is just as reliable, costs less, has fewer health impacts. The good news is that the costs of clean energy has come down so much, and the capabilities of batteries and other technologies has improved so much that we now can offer these countries and these communities a viable solution. So we don't need to tell them your investment is wasted, but actually working with them to deploy what we call coal transition mechanisms, which is how do you get that right combination that ensures that we have a technical solution to keep the lights on, that we've got a financial solution to ensure that, you know, people don't feel like they are stuck with a stranded asset and they've wasted good money. And that we also have a community solution, so that we have a solution that ensures that we have transition plans for workers, we have transition plans for communities that help us move from the existing coal assets towards new clean energy assets. And so that's one of the things that we're doing with partners across the globe to support the rapid transition away from coal-fired power plants.
Good. And I think next we go to Rushad to talk a little bit about the exciting work in cities that he is spearheading.
Thanks, Jules. So a member of our team, Mia Reback, actually co-authored the cities chapter of the recent IPCC report. One thing the report calls out is the importance of what it describes as compact and resource-efficient urban growth. So cities around the world, not just in the global south, but even right here in the US, are growing really, really fast. From 55% of the global population today to nearly 70% of the global population by the end of this next decade. Unfortunately, one of the problems is that urban land area, the actual physical footprint of cities, is growing much, much faster. Basically, that's the opposite of the compact and resource-efficient urban growth that the report calls for. And it's something that we absolutely desperately need to change if we're going to have any shot at this 1.5 degrees Celsius future. If we get it right, if we actually establish patterns of urban growth and development that are less car-centric, less sprawling, less segregated, that same IPCC analysis tells us that we can reduce emissions by something like 23 or 26% by 2050 compared with business as usual. And so we have a team dedicated precisely to that agenda, to what we call climate-aligned urbanism, working with cities on housing policy, urban land use, smart growth, so that we're not just decarbonizing individual assets, which is critically important, but we're not just making individual buildings more efficient, not just swapping out gas-fueled cars for EVs, but we're actually helping build the right types of buildings in the right places, so that we're reducing the need for cars altogether. And ultimately, I'm glad we kicked off with Amory, because this is Amory's logic of deep energy efficiency, logic of integrative design applied at the scale of a city, which is absolutely critical in the context of the energy transition. There was actually a great piece in the New York Times today about Portland's struggle with precisely these issues that actually features some of our work. Maybe I can put it in the chat at some point.
Thank you, Rushad. And let's then pivot over to Brian, who maybe can talk a little bit about how we're going to pay for all of this, Brian.
And pay for it we need to do, as the IPCC report estimates that we need 3 to 6 times the amount of capital that we see flowing into low carbon solutions today. And given the fact that by our estimates, 70% of that capital needs to come from private sources, we essentially have on our hands the challenge of transforming the symbiotic relationship we have with large financial institutions with a global economy that runs primarily on fossil fuel. Now, fortunately, because of incredible activist pressure and leadership at some of these institutions, we're now seeing financial institutions pledge to go net zero, which, if fulfilled, would allow the financing to flow that we need to have. And yet today, not one of those institutions is able to overcome the barriers that would allow that pledge to become reality. So RMI Center for Climate Aligned Finance is dedicated solely to knocking down both barriers and excuses that are preventing implementation of that pledge, and making sure that that pledge translates into real economy impact. For example, in shipping, the RMI Center brokered the Poseidon Principles, which led to 50% of all global financing to pledge on a decarbonization pathway. And not only that, but to have accountability through annual reporting on the same metrics to cut through the greenwashing, to enable that shareholders, stakeholders, and policymakers can hold these financial institutions into account as they move forward. But Jules, as you know, finance isn't actually about the future. If you ask underrepresented communities in the United States, if you ask developing countries, if you look at small island nations, this is about the needs of today and over a century of underrepresentation. So that's why the work that RMI programs such as the Realize Initiative, which aims to create a market and financing for low-income sustainable housing that would be net zero, and also the Climate Finance Access Network, which is putting financial advisors in the most vulnerable small island nations to access the Byzantine climate finance system that they need to have to protect and preserve their country, is so important, and why we're really excited to take Amory's lead and have a systemic approach to a systemic problem.
Thanks, Dean. It was really helpful to hear that. And I think, Brian, particularly your mention of some obstacles that your team is working on, I think opens up the next question for me. Amy Westerfeld, a climate journalist, specifically noted that in the IPCC report, it was made abundantly clear that technologies and policies necessary to adequately address the climate change already exist. And RMI has said that for a long time, right? We have it, we just have to convince people. Some of that is human nature. But in her point, Ms. Westerfeld said that she believed the only real obstacles are politics and fossil fuel interests. So I'd love to come back to the three program leaders, starting with you, Lena, and then maybe Rushad, then Brian. Lena, how is your carbon-free electricity team working to overcome those or other obstacles?
Thanks, Marty. I mean, one of the things we think about is the inertia of big organizations and how challenging it can be to get big organizations to shift. One of the things I like to, remind my team and our collaborators is that, over 99% of humanity's electricity is delivered by some kind of utility somewhere. And these are critical institutions. They've helped us to build one of the most sophisticated and impressive machines, providing a critical service to humanity, the power grids that are so critical to our economies. And they're a great example of a large and significant institution that we need to be ready to make very significant changes. Marty, that, I have spent a lot of time serving in the Navy and know personally firsthand, and I think this is a useful metaphor, that big ships turn slowly. But just like a big ship turns slowly, big organizations change slowly at first. And in the same way that a slight change of a rudder angle actually is the thing that sets a much bigger turn in motion, we know through the work that our team does on innovation and thinking about the causes and ingredients of innovation in our electricity innovation lab, we're working with utilities and companies and governments to build their ability and recognize these opportunities to implement and experiment with and capture these small changes that can lead to and build confidence in much bigger changes that will set these more significant transformations of the industry in motion.
Great analogy. Rushad, I know your urban transformation team works with a diverse range of political issues, so curious to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Marty. Yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to help cities with the capacity and the ability to execute. Quite often, they know what needs to happen. You know, people know that urban emissions or cities' emissions are predominantly related to transportation and buildings, and by extension, the power sector. We know what, as you put it in your lead-in question, we know what the answers are. We know what the policies and practices are. So when we started our cities program, we were very, very clear that we did not want to be in the business of high-level commitments and high-level planning. There are plenty of people doing that. There are lots of good plans out there. In other words, there's lots and lots of good theory. And as Amory put it in his intro, we don't do theory, we do practice, or perhaps we do praxis. Help cities turn that theory into action. Projects that are implemented and policies that are actually enacted and enforced. And that's our focus, because cities constantly tell us that this is what they need. They need deeply practical technical assistance and implementation support. Jules mentioned I just got back from India, where I spent time with leaders in Delhi and Chennai, two cities we're working with really, really closely. And these city leaders are truly remarkable people. They're wickedly smart. They're deeply committed to making an impact, and they're facing this massive challenge. Chennai is 5 million people. Delhi is 25 million people. And you can literally see these cities growing in front of you before your eyes. And they were super clear in these conversations. No more plans, no more working groups, no more committees. Give us projects, help us implement them. Don't tell us, work with us. And at RMI and at this program in particular, that's really music to our ears.
Yeah, that's incredible. Brian, more maybe about incentives.
Yeah, the good news is that everybody knows that finance needs to be part of the solution. And right now there's so much noise, a cacophony of voices giving their own ideas about what the solution would be. And in the midst of that, maybe we have a little bit of clever marketing that is profiting from this urgency without actually contributing to the solution. So while we need to look at 2050, which is such an incredibly important date for humanity, we have to give more tangible guidance about what are we going to do in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, particularly in a moment of turmoil as we're seeing in global energy markets now because of what's happening in Ukraine and elsewhere. So one of the reports that we will have later this year is the Climate Report of the Future. This is looking 2 years ahead in the future and saying this is what we expect large financial institutions to be reporting on. This is not about signaling ambition. These are the metrics and the KPIs that we are going to expect financial institutions to actually implement in order to demonstrate a clear effect onto the global economy. We are also close to being able to announce a very important partnership that would be able to provide analytics to be able to look at each dollar of investment and what that will mean on a decarbonization trajectory, which I'm very excited to come to later in this year to talk about.
Great, sounds like another webinar in our future. That's great. Jules, having heard all that, I'm really curious to hear your 30,000-foot view on how RMI takes on these obstacles and maybe what you see as our greatest challenges and opportunities, given what's happening around the globe right now.
Yeah, Amy Westerveld is right. We have the technologies, we know what the solutions are, but it is about mobilization and implementation and execution and delivery. And things do get in the way. First and foremost, misinformation, myth, storylines, narratives out there that are not accurate and that paint a picture that this is incredibly hard and that it's going to cause a lot of financial setbacks for global economies. Absolutely no longer the truth. In fact, the reality is, as Leia already said, low carbon production of electricity is now the most cost-effective solution. Soon, electric cars are going to be cheaper upfront than in internal combustion engine cars. Energy efficiency has always paid for itself. So this is not a huge economic barrier. Then what really is the barrier? And the barrier is, of course, one of misinformation, of politics, and of leadership. And you see that right now in the backdrop against the backdrop of the horrible war that Putin is conducting against Ukraine. The answer to the energy crisis that is the result of the Ukraine war is not to double down on fossil fuels. Maybe, yes, it is to, in the short run, produce some more from existing operations, but anything beyond 6 months, the answer is to double down on the energy transition, to invest in the things that are already profitable in the electricity arena, but also to take bold and courageous moves to accelerate the technologies that are not yet in the money. And it's striking to me, having recently been to Europe, how that realization in that part of the world is much more alive. In fact, the European Commission has doubled down on their goals for the energy transition by 2030 in the wake of this horrible war. But here in the United States, there seems to be confusion. There is a part of the political spectrum that thinks that the answer is just drill, baby, drill. And that is, of course, nonsense. That is not the right answer. So from our perspective, these obstacles are there. They revolve around politics and leadership. And yes, misinformation from the fossil fuel industry in the past has played a very significant role in that as well. I think a little bit less so now. But the answers are increasingly becoming clear. And the good news is the rest of the world is no longer confused about what needs to happen. China is doubling down on the deployment of low carbon energy solutions. Europe has committed to increase their decarbonization efforts over the next 8 years. We're seeing it in India. We're seeing it all around the global south. So momentum is building.
So Amory, I'm thinking you might have a quick remark on obstacles, sort of what you've heard over the last few moments, and then we'll go to our final question about programs and next, what's on their horizon.
Among our most important allies, if not the most important, is mindful capital markets. That's why I'm so excited about the work Brian described. And just two little benchmarks to show how quickly things can change. At times over the past year, Apple has been bigger than all 16 of the biggest publicly traded hydrocarbon companies combined. And Tesla has been bigger, again, in market cap than most or all of the other significant automakers in the world combined. Who would have said a few years ago that that enormous shift in value could happen? But it did, because investors are realizing how to rebalance their risks and rewards. And we are redoubling our efforts to help them understand how to do that even faster.
Thanks, that's great. I'm thinking as we close out this part of our hour, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, I'd love to go back to the three program leaders again, our managing directors who are in this day in and day out with their teams. As the climate clock ticks, many are asking, where do we go from here? So I'd love for you to share with our audience maybe a client solution you're scaling right now, one that will bring immediate results, one that you're most excited about. We'll start with you, Brian.
So the good news is that after COP last November, there is an unprecedented amount of capital that is pledged to transition, particularly for the global south. And I have the privilege to be pulling together a cross-program team that is going to be looking at how can we reimagine an 80-year-old system of development finance, Bretton Woods system level capital management to end poverty and to take advantage of the amazing work that is happening in India and Southeast Asia and Africa, and to reimagine exactly what we need to do to provide not only the capital, but really to set our ambition on the fact that every single country on earth wants, and I believe deserves, to be able to have the standard of living that the majority of Americans have in this country. That's the ambition we have. And it just so happens that we need to do it in a way that avoids global warming.
Wow, that'd be incredible. Leia, carbon-free electricity.
Thanks, Marty. I mean, one of the solutions our team has been working on that we've been excited about for several years and continue to be excited about is the opportunity to scale what we call clean energy portfolios. And I know this might sound a little wonky. Sometimes I like to describe a clean energy portfolio as a non-gas plant. But really what it is it's what Amory has been talking about for so long. It's this perfect combination of solutions like energy efficiency, smart controllable loads, solar, wind, batteries, and smart controls that can do everything a gas plant can do. And what's more, can do it even better and at lower cost. All right. But this is a lot like the smartphone revolution in the early days, when it took a while to get used to the fact that I have this new device that I can do very different things with. And I'm going to pay for it differently. And I'm going to have a different type of contract with my service provider. And that's part of where the industry is right now, is they're sort of getting used to the fact that the way you buy a clean energy portfolio is not the same way that you buy a gas plant or a coal plant. And they're getting used to the fact that I can do a lot of different things with it than I can do with my gas plant or my coal plant. And also they're getting used to the fact that you can, in a lot of ways, actually deploy it so much faster, because you can deploy rooftop solar and energy efficiency in homes and batteries way faster than you can build some of these behemoth generating stations. And so the industry is just starting to figure this out, and they're kind of getting used to it and getting excited about it. And so this is something that we're continuing to work on that I'm excited about.
That is exciting. And we don't remember what it was like without our phones. So it'll be good when we don't remember those coal and gas plants. Rushad, urban transformation.
Yeah, it's hard to choose just one. It's kind of like being asked to choose between your kids, but I'll maybe show some recency bias here. I mentioned being in Delhi and Chennai. I was there for an initiative I'm really, really excited about, which is focused on comprehensive, sustainable urban cooling solutions. It's a program that we've developed and are executing in partnership with the UN Environment Program. Cities are warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. Under a business as usual scenario, India could have up to 200 million people exposed to deadly heat waves in the next couple of decades. And at the same time, we're seeing this exploding demand for air conditioning. The energy consumption and emissions associated with that demand alone could eat up half the world's remaining carbon budget. So a massively important human problem and a massively important climate and emissions problem. And if we're going to address this problem, we need to apply the kind of whole systems thinking that's RMI's calling card. So we've identified and have started working with these cities on 6 different solutions. And I'll mention just a couple. I won't go through the whole list. At the scale of the individual room, a large-scale effort to replace inefficient air conditioners with the most climate-friendly cooling technology available. Building materials and coatings that can deliver thermal comfort to people living in really, really low income, in some cases even informal and slum housing. That notion of delivering disproportionate benefits to the people in greatest need is a hallmark of a lot of the work we do at RMI. Helping Delhi revive and enhance thousands of acres of urban forests, parks, and gardens. Urban nature is a really massively underappreciated climate solution, both from a carbon sequestration standpoint, but also critically from an energy saving standpoint. Green and blue spaces, for example, can have a profound cooling effect on a city. So we want to really, really go big on this sustainable urban cooling effort in India, and eventually in other parts of the global south as well, in Southeast Asia and Africa. And I'm really, really excited about the start that we're off to.
And I know there are many more, not just from your teams, but from all the other programs at RMI. So we do look forward to having more conversations with all of you in the audience as well. And we're going to turn to some questions. We're getting some good ones. We're going to get through as many as we can. The first one is from Seema Paul from Sequoia. Can U.S. standards of living be achieved sustainably? Do we need sustainable standards of living? Jules, how about you?
Thank you, Marty, and thank you, Seema. Good to see your name here and to be in touch. That is a very important and valid question, and one can certainly wonder whether the very product and consumption-oriented lifestyle in the United States is a good one for our planet, is a wise one for human beings, and is sustainable. And I would argue, but this is not a formal RMI position, that by golly, can we not do with a little bit less stuff? But having said that, solving this problem is so much more about the standard of living and the well-being of people all around the world, and particularly of people in the global south. Over the course of the last 2 years at RMI, we've built climate justice much more into everything we do. And it has certainly helped me realize how the impacts of climate change are hitting the most vulnerable in the global south much more significantly, much earlier, much more damagingly than anywhere else in the world, certainly than here in the United States. Yes, maybe we get worked up, concerned, scared from the wildfires here in the Boulder area over the last year, but hundreds of people lost their lives in South Africa just in the last couple of weeks because of horrible rainstorms that are clearly linked to increased temperatures and higher humidity and extreme weather events associated with climate change. But also, if the US can have a standard of living that we all have to question may not be sustainable for the future, how about the standard of living of those most vulnerable in India, in Africa, and in small island states? The fact that we have used up the carbon budgets for humanity in the developed world doesn't mean that we cannot, that we can afford to say there cannot be development in those countries that have not been on that development journey yet. So we have to solve this problem. And that does mean finding ways in which we can have a good standard of living, but at a lower carbon footprint and also with a lower materials impact. And I think that is feasible, but by golly, there's a lot of work for us to be done.
Indeed. I'd love to, maybe Rushad, one of our questions is, how are we engaging people within communities and cities where we're working? Maybe you could drill down a little bit to that community level.
Sure. So very, very deeply, and I'll maybe just offer a couple of examples. So one of the things that we've been doing recently is helping a number of cities run solarized campaigns. So bulk procurement campaigns for rooftop solar targeted at lower income communities and communities of color. Communities of color, because even once you control for income, rooftop solar adoption in Black and brown communities in the US is far, far lower than what you would expect statistically. So we've worked with now at this point about 40 odd cities across the US on these projects. In each instance, the city in question has partnered with a local community, frontline community-based organization, and in many instances, more than one. And each of these solarized campaigns has been co-developed by the city in partnership with these frontline community-based organizations with our assistance. So in any, and that's one example, but it's representative of a principle that we've articulated for ourselves, which is that in any community-facing work that we do, that engagement with frontline community-based organizations has to be part of the package. The development of any solution has to happen in conjunction with them, and the benefits from a distributional equity perspective have to disproportionately flow to those communities in question. And so that's, maybe the, again, maybe recency bias at play, because I just got a report from the team on on how that latest cohort wrapped up. But that approach is pretty representative of our work overall.
Right. And Leah, I know your electricity team works a lot in communities, particularly in the US. So maybe you have some follow on. Particularly, I see another question from Seema about how do we scale that work with cities in time?
Absolutely. So one of the ways the electricity program is engaging communities and working with communities is in particular working with utilities here in the US, but we see opportunities to do this globally, helping the utilities to build their capabilities and infrastructure to partner with communities, particularly in the way they do resource planning. For many, many decades, the way utilities planned and designed the system could be likened to a bunch of engineers going into a dark windowless room and figuring it out all by themselves. And that's not really the best and most efficient way to do it now in 2022, in particular, when we think about the type of community-informed, dynamic, decarbonized electricity system we need. And so we've been working with utilities to help them establish community advisory groups, equity advisory groups, to think differently about modeling and using open source tools instead of proprietary tools. And part of why we think there's scaling potential in this is particularly with utilities. With types of utilities, there is a sort of non-traditional, not so competitive dynamic because of how their service territories are franchised to them. And that creates an important sharing and learning opportunity that can create, we think, scalable trajectories for these approaches to proliferate to multiple utilities much more quickly. We need to do a lot more on scaling, but that's one scaling vector that we think is an opportunity to bring these new approaches to partnering with communities and planning differently to more places more quickly.
Great answer. Brian, we have a question from Martin. Wall Street is notorious for funneling money into unsustainable channels. How do you assess the ability of green banks and public banking to fund loans for the energy transition at the local level?
It's a fantastic question, and it gets to not only a sense of ownership and motivation for the solutions that are truly unique in climate and not just about profit, but also how we're actually going to be able to scale. So, as you know, finance is not just a one institution giving money to one customer, but it all funnels through an entire system. And what we see as an opportunity, particularly on green banks, is where you have a particular climate mission that sits alongside the fiduciary responsibilities that are in place. It was the UK Green Bank that really kick-started the offshore wind market. And there's a reason, actually, from a competitiveness and security perspective, that the UK now is a leader in offshore wind in the world, and the United States is catching up. I sit on the Export-Import Bank's chair's Climate Council, and we are trying to figure out how we catch up to the offshore wind sector. But you also can tailor make green banks to sit in the very communities that have been underserved for a number of years, both the United States, and then also, if you hear about the news that we're seeing as far as, oligarchs' money that is being frozen in London or Vancouver or New York or elsewhere, you see that there's so much capital in developing countries that are not being reinvested in their economies, but are actually moving, abroad. And a green bank is a way that you can actually capture some of that institutional homegrown capital and allow developing countries to have ownership over their future. So I see a very bright future for green banks.
Great. Jules, I'm thinking maybe it would be great to hear from you on a question, interesting question, in fact, citing some comments from our program, Third Derivative. Can you talk about, quote, false solutions, end quote, that may slow progress? As Third Derivative notes, 75% of investments flowed into, quote, shiny, end quote, tech that only impacted 20% of emissions. Your thoughts?
Yeah. First of all, it is important to recognize we're facing a planetary emergency, and therefore we need to deploy every tool that we have in the toolbox. We have to find mechanisms to scale up all the viable solutions. And now is not the time to say, well, that one might be slightly better than that one. No, if it works and if it decarbonizes our economy, we should be doing it, and we should be doing it at scale. Some technologies are clearly already there and are financially very viable and therefore need to be ramped up massively, particularly in Leia's area, wind and solar, but also, as I mentioned earlier, electric vehicles now very close to a tipping point, and energy efficiency already working for a very long time. But in the area of the sectors that sometimes people refer to as hard to abate, those sectors where we don't have all the answers yet, in those sectors, we still need technology innovation. We still need new solutions. How do you produce maybe different chemistries of cement that don't, by their nature, emit so much CO2? Or how do you reduce iron ore with hydrogen instead of with coal, thereby dramatically reducing the emissions of CO2 associated with steel production? And sustainable aviation fuel is another area where we don't have all the answers yet and certainly are not yet ready for scaling. So we need to invest in those solutions. Now, then there are indeed some people who talk about solutions where we are not terribly excited about the potential that they can bring to the table. For example, carbon capture and storage. Is that really a solution that we will see come up at scale fast enough so as to make a significant contribution? We certainly haven't seen the fossil fuel industry deploy carbon capture and storage as a large solution over the last 20 years. What's going to change now? But having said that, the IPCC report calls out very explicitly the need for large-scale sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere. If we want to try to hit 1.5 degrees, we're going to need to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. And it could well be that lessons can be learned from carbon capture and storage that we can then in turn apply to so-called direct air capture, essentially using that same technology with the air around us. So I'm hesitant to say that we should not try almost everything. Maybe there are some things where it really doesn't make sense, but in most cases, I think it's worth to try because we are in such dire straits. We've got to find all the solutions that can work and contribute.
Yeah, and another question came up while you're on the floor there, Jules. We're close to closing, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about the question on blockchain. Where does that fit in now with what we're doing? Because RMI has broken some ground there.
Absolutely, and very important to note, blockchain, not Bitcoin. There are blockchain technologies that work without that horrible mining for the next block on the chain. Those blockchain technologies work with a different mechanism than Bitcoin. And so the blockchain solution that RMI has helped roll out, the Energy Web Foundation, works with an energy footprint the size of a normal building. So actually completely different. Blockchain can actually contribute significantly, both in processing the small transactions on the electricity grid that we need so that my electric car can be charged with the solar panels from the neighbor or from the battery of the neighbors on the other side, or to keep track of the carbon attributes of every goods and service around our economy. How do we translate tracking carbon emissions, steel and cement, to the carbon emissions associated with a car or a steel beam or a building, etc. So we believe blockchain can play an important role, but it needs to be a form of blockchain or distributed ledger technology that does not use proof of work, does not use an abundance of energy to operate.
Thanks, Jules. Thanks, Leia, Rushad, even in just from India with your cup of coffee, Brian, Amory, and certainly Jules. This has been a really terrific conversation. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. We want to close on time. We appreciate and value your time. But you had some great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we're happy to follow up with those of you where we need to. Our work is certainly made possible through donor support. We do some fee-for-service work with our partners, but most of our work is powered and funded by donors. So we want to announce that we have a spring appeal. And once again this year, one of our donors, whom I hope is in the audience, Richard Landers, is matching 50% and all spring gifts. And gifts over 5,000 will be doubled up to 125,000. You can go to rmi.org/give now, or you could give tomorrow on Earth Day, or you could give next week on our anniversary. But keep us in your plans and thoughts. And thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to our next conversation. Have a great day or evening.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.